Hello, everyone. We'll get started here in just a few moments. Thanks for joining us. Feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the chat. Or if you have questions already that you want to get posted, put that in the Q&A. And sit tight and we'll get started in just a minute. We have Dr. John Cronin from NWEA joining us. So thanks so much, John, for taking the time to be here.
Good morning, everyone. Or I guess I should say good morning or afternoon. It's morning here.
Yeah, well, you get a good afternoon from me. Okay, people are still joining. And if you have comments, feel free to put those in the chat. But if you have specific questions that you'd like to be addressed, we encourage you to put that in the Q&A instead. I assume the recording of the webinar will be emailed to us. Thanks, Richard, for that question. Yes, in the follow-up, everybody will be sent a link to the recording. And in addition, the original registration link, that'll convert to an on-demand registration link. Great. Okay. We're just at the hour, so why don't we get started? Once again, thanks everyone for joining us for this NCEA webinar. We appreciate that you're here with us. And before we do anything else, let's start off with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Just a few housekeeping notes before I pass it off to Dr. Cronin. If you have any questions, feel free to submit those in the Q&A and join the conversation in the chat box. You can select whether you want to communicate with all panelists and all of the attendees, or just Dr. Cronin and myself. And for specific questions, again, we encourage you to use the Q&A so we make sure we catch it. Also, if you're interested in a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, please complete the post-webinar survey, which will be shared at a number of points during and after the webinar, along with the slide deck. So with that, I will pass it off to Dr. John Cronin from NWEA. Thanks so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Cronin. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at NWEA. And today we're going to talk about two projects that we've been working on for the last couple of years. And they both relate to the intersection between student growth, student achievement, and family income. I want to particularly spend some time today on how that issue or question might affect Catholic schools. And that will come later in the presentation, but I hope that you will find it interesting. Just for your information, before I was at NWEA, I did a couple of other things, but one of them was I taught for 13 years history, English, computer programming at a Jesuit high school. So I've got background in both the public school system and the Catholic school system, and the research that we're talking about today is research that involves both, it involves a whole group of schools: Catholic, parochial, public, charter. So I think you will find that interesting. I'd also like to introduce two colleagues who are on three colleagues who are on the webinar with us. Diane Cronin, who I am related to, she's my wife, who's the Senior Account Executive for Catholic Schools, Jessica Neeram, who's our Executive Account Manager, and Mark Duquette, who's our Account Manager. If you want more information about the presentation today or more information about NWEA, I would encourage you to contact Diane or Jessica, and they'll be happy to talk to you about the research and some of the things that NWEA does. So let's just dig straight into the research. The original research on this question was done by my colleague Andy Hagedis. And Andy has always had an interest in the relationship between family income and student growth, and how we use student achievement data to hold schools accountable. He did a study of 1,500 schools about 4 years ago where he looked at those two factors, uh, free and reduced lunch, which is the factor you see on the x-axis in this graph, and the mean student achievement, which is the axis that you see on the y graph. And what was found was something that's not surprising to anybody. He found that there's a fairly strong relationship between family income and student achievement. In other words, the lower the rate of family poverty, in other words, the closer you get to zero in this particular graph on the x-axis, the higher that student achievement tends to be. And, you know, for close to 40 or 50 years, we've thought about high student achievement as actually being the mark of a good school. But that's not necessarily the case. So Andy went on and looked at a second dimension of the issue, which is what's the relationship between family income and student growth. And in this case, when he was looking at student growth, he was looking at the difference between fall and spring reading and math achievement among the students in these 1,500 public schools. So when he looked at that relationship, here's what he found. As you can see, the green arrow is nearly flat, and it's the green arrow that represents the relationship between family income and student growth. So what Andy found was that there's only a very slight relationship between higher income and student growth. And the other thing you see that's kind of striking when you look at this graph is that the amount of growth shown by each school varies really widely, and it varies widely across the entire distribution. So you have schools with very high poverty rates if you look at the left side of the graph, and you can see that some of those schools have the highest growth rate of any of the schools in the entire study. And unfortunately, you can also see at the left end of the graph the reverse. You see some of the lowest growth schools in the study are also schools with high poverty. And when you look at the right side, you see a little bit narrower distribution, but you kind of see the same thing. You see some low poverty schools that produce pretty high growth, and some low poverty schools that don't produce a lot of growth at all. I remember when I was teaching in a Jesuit school, we did standardized tests there every year. It was a high school. And one of the things we liked to tout in our marketing materials was that our kids' achievement started above the 90th percentile and it ended at the 90th percentile. So if you're going to put us on this graph, we were probably somewhere either near that line or maybe even below it. And I used to joke that our marketing slogan ought to be Gonzaga Prep, it wouldn't hurt to come. Because we really weren't showing any evidence that we were improving the outcomes of our students at that time. Now that was 25 years ago, so I'm sure things are a lot different today. So Andy did this study about 4 years ago, and the next thing he looked at was 4 illustrations that came out of the study they used to characterize what a high performing or low performing school might be. So typically, like I said, we've characterized high performing schools as high achieving schools. But a high achieving school isn't necessarily creating high levels of learning. So one of the things Andy argued for was separating performance into achievement on the one side and growth on the other. And achievement's important because achievement does a lot to determine kids' ultimate outcomes in the educational system, right? So if a student's high achieving, they're more likely to qualify to go to a better college. They're more likely to have the kind of math proficiency that will allow them to take subjects like engineering or computer programming or other technical work as they get to the end of high school or start whatever their post-secondary education is. So we don't want to ignore the value of high achievement. We just don't want to judge schools purely on whether they're high achievement. And when we talk about growth, we try to talk about the amount of progress that students make uh, during schooling. And in our case, we always control, when we look at growth, we always control for the starting achievement of the kid, because students that are high achieving generally across the board show less growth than students who are low achieving. So when we develop a norm for growth or when we do studies of growth, we always control for achievement so that we're comparing a high achieving school and a low achieving school's growth on the same playing field. So given that, I'd invite you to look at 4 cases. The first is a low achieving school, and you see 2 graphs here. The graph on the left shows the percentage of students in each achievement decile. So you have 160 students here in the 0 to 10th percentile of achievement, 99 students in the 10th to 20th, and so on. And you see that most of them are concentrated in the lower ranges. What you're seeing on the right is their relative growth. So you see that the school is showing a very high, what we call a conditional growth index, which is our way of measuring growth, um, across both the low achieving deciles, but also the high achieving deciles. So we would call this school low achieving, but it's high growth, higher than normal growth for virtually every achievement decile. Now, granted, when you get to the highest achieving kids, it's only slightly above average, but since most of the kids are concentrated at the low end of the achievement distribution, they're doing very well. So if we were to put the school in a quadrant, we would say this school is low achieving, but high growth. Contrast that with the school now on your right. Their fall achievement started in the 21st percentile, and you can see that their achievement profile is very similar to this school on the left. However, their average growth almost across the board is below average. So this school is in a pretty dire position where the kids are not only losing or are not only low achieving, they're also losing ground every year. Now, if we were looking at what kinds of schools really need to be the focus of our efforts, if we're going to move toward having more equity and equality, this is the kind of school that really needs emergency focus because it's both low achieving and low growth. Now, there's 2 other cases we could look at too. This is a school that I will refer to later when we start talking about the second phase of the work that Andy Haggett has started. But you see, it's a school where most of the students are already high achieving. You've got the vast majority in either the 8th or the 9th decile. So they're all in the top 20% of achievement. But you can see, regardless of where the students are starting, their growth is above average across the board. So this is a pretty high flying school. It has high achievement, but it also has high growth. And these kids would be making up ground virtually every year on their peer group. The other case, whoops, and let me go back up here. There we go. The other case is also a high achieving school. You can see it's a little bit smaller, but it's very similar to the school on the left. It's high achieving, but you can see that fall to spring growth is only at the 39th percentile, and growth is below average for almost all of the deciles in which they have a significant number of students. This is a school that's kind of skating in a sense. It's a school that's high achieving, but they're not really adding a lot of value in terms of academic growth for their students on a year-to-year basis. some would call this, this would be a school that also needs attention because uh, while the students are doing well, they could be doing much better. So Andy did this work, and when he finished, he intended to pursue a second study in which he isolated schools that were high growth for all their kids. So what he wanted to do was isolate the schools on the left side of the last two slides that you just saw. Schools that may be low achieving but achieve high growth, schools that may be high achieving but also achieve high growth. And unfortunately, Andy was a pretty young guy, um, had a rare case of very aggressive prostate cancer, and very sadly for us, Andy passed in May of last year. Um, so the study he intended to pursue was on the books, and my colleague Greg King and I worked with Andy to take on that study, and that's the work that we're doing right now. Um, we're, whoops, I want to go back a slide. There we go. Um, so we started that study this past May, and the study involves over 17,500 schools. And we looked at over 4 years of data for each of the schools to find schools that are high growth for all. When we talk about a high growth for all school, what we required in this study was that the schools show above average growth in 3 out of the 4 years, that they show above average growth both fall to spring and spring to spring, and that they show high growth for any decile of students that has more than any decile that has more than 20 students in it for starting achievement. So the schools that met those criteria ultimately were identified as high growth for all. And then once we identified those schools, we looked at their profile demographics to see where they were and what kinds of schools they were. Our final group included public schools, of course, charter schools, private schools, parochial schools, and even specialty schools. And once we identified those schools, we also wanted to look at their long-term impact on student learning. So we not only looked at their growth, but we also looked at over a 4-year period, how much of an impact growth over our norms had on their student achievement. And this study is still in process. So what I'll be sharing with you today are some preliminary results from that study, but it's going to be coming out later this spring. So here's a preview. Whoops. I just walked you through the qualifications for the high growth for all schools. And now here's what we found in regard to the Catholic schools. We found 952 Catholic schools in the sample. So of the 17,500 studied, 952 Catholic schools had 4 years of data that we could evaluate that qualified them to be within the study. Of the 952 Catholic schools in the sample, though, we found only 16 Catholic schools that qualified as high growth for all. That's about 1.8%. Now, that may seem a little depressing, but our criteria were quite strict. And among the public schools in the sample, we only found about 4.5% that qualified as high growth for all. Now, why might it be that there were fewer Catholic schools in the final sample than there were public schools? We don't fully understand the reasons, but we have a couple of possible reasons that we think that may be the case. One is more and more public schools are highly accountable for the growth results that they achieve on our test. Their growth results may be reflected in the evaluations of principals, or in some cases, even in the evaluations of teachers. There's also some accountability on state tests for the growth that students show on state assessments in many states now each year. And so principals and teachers in those schools tend to be pretty hyper focused on growth at times, most of the time. And that sometimes reflects also in testing practices. In other words, they're very careful in a lot of public schools about testing practices to make sure the kids have all the time that they need or want to complete the test. They treat the test with a very high degree of importance in many of these schools. And that's not necessarily always the case in Catholic schools, because Catholic schools do not necessarily use our test for the same reason. Um, Many of our Catholic schools are using this primarily as a guide for instruction. So they may not be, they may be interested in the growth results, but in many of our Catholic schools, principals or teachers are not going to be evaluated on the growth they achieve on a year-to-year basis. And the stakes associated with the test are going to be lower. So that may explain some of the difference. But it's also fair to say that traditionally Catholic schools have marketed themselves primarily based on their achievement. And most Catholic schools are high achieving. So given that fact, there may not be as much focus right now on growth within Catholic schools as there is elsewhere. And we think that's an important point to draw to your attention as we share results of this kind of study, because high achievement alone really isn't what we should be seeking in our kids. We want to be seeking to take the kids where they are and then take them as far beyond that as we can. So we found 16 Catholic schools that are doing some pretty interesting things. Let me share something more about what those schools are doing. So what you're looking at here is the growth between the Catholic schools in the study that were high growth for all, and it's expressed as a standardized score, a Z-score, and the Catholic schools in the sample that were not identified as high growth for all. So on the left, we have fall to spring growth, and on the right, we have spring to spring growth. And there's something really interesting in this data. First of all, what you can see is that the Catholic schools that are high growth for all in the studies enjoy about a 0.2 to 0.3 standard deviation advantage in growth year over year from the schools that were not identified as high growth for all. And you can also see, and this kind of reinforces the point I was making about Catholic schools not necessarily paying as much attention to the testing conditions as public schools do. You can see that fall to spring growth is below average in the Catholic schools that were not high growth for all. But then when you go to the spring to spring data, which to me is a more reliable indicator of the actual growth provided, that the schools that are not high growth for all do better. In fact, they show above average growth spring to spring. So I see that as kind of an encouraging finding when it comes to Catholic schools. But you can see that there's an advantage that the high growth for all schools enjoy in growth, and there should be, right? They produced a consistent pattern of high growth. So that kind of led to this next question, which is, okay, if you have growth that's 0.3 of a standard deviation above average every year, what impact does that seem to have on achievement? So now we're looking at the difference between the high growth for all schools, which are on the orange bar, and the not high growth for all schools, which are the blue line. And you see the achievement percentile over the 4-year period for an intact cohort of grade 2 to 5 kids in each of those schools. What you see among the high growth for all Catholic schools is that group started with higher achievement than the group that was not identified. And you can see over the 4-year period, they had a particularly big bump between second and third grade. and then their growth seems to stabilize beyond that. But they grow students from about the 70th percentile to the 79th percentile. Now, that can be pretty challenging. In some ways, we kind of understate what those Catholic schools are kind of doing, because when you take students that are already high achieving and then move them up this far in the distribution, um, the kids have to show more movement on the scale to get there than they would have to show if they're in the middle of the distribution. Um, this also, when you move the average achievement from the 70th percentile to the 80th percentile, you're also moving a lot of kids from a level where if they sustain that achievement over 12 years, they would be ready for college, to a level where many of those kids are going to be ready for a more selective college and may be eligible for more merit aid. Now, fifth grade, again, we're looking at second to fifth grade in this part of the study. We have a second part of the study where we looked at grades 6 through 8. But if they sustain their achievement over time, they'd be very well prepared for college in the high growth for all schools. What you can see in the group that's identified as no is they show a slight improvement in achievement over the 4-year period. They go from the 57th to the 59th percentile, but basically achievement stays relatively steady. This third graph shows the difference in growth between the high growth for all and the yes and no group by starting decile. And I thought that this was interesting too. One of the things you'll see, and this pattern is not terribly unusual, among the majority of the schools that were not identified as high growth for all, you still see above average growth among the lowest achieving kids. And one of the things that traditionally Catholic schools have done relatively well is they've supported the growth and achievement of low achieving or high poverty kids that they happen to have inside their schools. While the pattern you see here, even among the no group, reflects that. Where the schools that are not high growth for all struggle, as you can see, and again, this is a fairly common pattern, is with the school students at the 70th percentile and above. If you look at the difference between the no group and the yes group, I think the thing that's probably most striking is how much more dramatic the growth is for the low achieving kids. You can see that they're achieving some really strong gains, and that's how those get reflected in average percentile rankings, or median percentile rankings, I should say, when you look at the other slide. And then you see that they sustain these gains even with the high performing students. So when you look at and I guess the other thing I want to make sure I emphasize in this, the pattern that we're seeing among Catholic schools isn't much different than the pattern that we're seeing in public schools. The most interesting stuff to me, if you're looking at the pattern and the differences between high growth for all public schools and high growth for all Catholic schools, is the achievement profiles are very similar. I would expect among public schools, the high growth is pretty heavily concentrated among schools of above average income. And because that's the case, one of the things that was relatively rare was seeing a lot of high growth schools within the inner city, high growth public schools, I should say, within the inner city. Among the high growth urban schools that we did see, they were generally enclaves within a city, within a large city of high family income being served by an urban school in that location. So among public schools, the pattern generally was the higher the income, the more likely that a school would be identified as high growth for all. But again, of the 17,500 schools we studied, only 4.5% met the criteria of 3 out of 4 years high fall to spring growth, above average spring to spring growth and growth for all kids in the study. And among Catholic schools, again, that rate was about 1.8%. So the big conclusion we come to the study in the study, and there are basically two of them. One is um, we want to make sure we emphasize that while growth is a much better way to evaluate schools, and this probably extends to Catholic schools as well as public schools, the playing field is not level. Um, Parents with higher incomes have more resources that they can bring to bear on the education of their children. And if you're working in a Catholic school setting, particularly in a higher income community, I'm sure you see that within your own school community. Uh, Parents are able to travel with their kids more. They're able to make investments in things like tutoring if kids need it, or music lessons, or all kinds of other enrichment experiences uh, that are known to accelerate the growth of their students. So when we look at trying to do justice, uh, particularly uh, of those of us in Catholic education that are also committed to equity for all of our kids, one of the questions we want to make sure we keep asking ourselves is, how do we make a more enriched student experience available to all our kids, so that all kids who attend Catholic schools not only get a good basic education, but they also get an enriched experience that parallels, to the extent that it's possible within our resources, the kind of experience that uh, that wealthier or higher income parents are able to afford for their students. So that's basically an overview of where the study is now. We'll be announcing more about the study when it comes out later this spring. I hope you found this interesting, and this is probably a good time to see if there were things that came up in question or in chat that we should talk about further. Jonathan.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Cronin. So feel free to put more questions in the Q&A or in the chat box. And if there's a specific question that you'd like us to address, we're going to go through the Q&A. So thanks so much for your time and everyone joining us. So we have a few questions here. So one is, are these both elementary and secondary schools? And could you go through the age group in the study
Sure.
you're discussing?
When we identified the high growth for all schools, we looked all the way through K-12. And the group I was citing here were the Catholic K-6 or K-8 schools that were in the study. When we looked at evaluating the achievement gains that the schools enjoyed, we were limited to looking at grades 3 through 8 because those were the grades that we had test results for all the schools. We eliminated high schools from the achievement part of the study because most of them don't test beyond grade 10.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another one here is, so besides paying attention to testing conditions, what are other recommendations you might have for Catholic schools that they can do to have more growth?
Um, well, one is kind of what I was alluding to um, at the end of the presentation, which is, I think I know our resources in Catholic schools are limited, but one of the reasons that higher income schools have advantages over lower income schools is parents provide a more enriched experience for their kids. So they're getting kids exposure to music lessons, or they're getting kids tutoring or other services that are enhancing the experience. There can be a tendency at times in Catholic schools, in part because of resources, for us to starve the enrichment in order to provide a good basic education. And one of the things I would encourage is Catholic schools continuing to focus on not just providing a good basic education, but also looking at ways that they can provide some of those similar enrichment experiences to the kids that they would be getting in a higher income location. And there are some strategies that one can use to do that. I know when my wife was a principal, one of the things they used to do with auction funds, they would do their annual auction just like I'm sure all of you do. Uh, but they devoted a portion of the auction funds every year to enriching the school program uh, on top of just providing tuition assistance. And that was one small way they had of getting that enrichment to kids. At the Catholic school I taught in for 13 years, I taught at Gonzaga Prep, which was a high school in Spokane, Washington, Jesuit high school. One of the things they did for enrichment is they knew that most of the elementary schools didn't have elementary instrumental music programs. So they started an elementary band program at the high school, or that the high school sponsored, but instruction was delivered by my wife, by the way, uh, through all the elementary schools in the system. And that assured that all kids had access to an instrumental music experience at the elementary level. And there's a lot of data that shows instrumental music uh, is really, as a program, really helps kids with math and with all kinds of critical thinking skills. So that is one thing that I would encourage. The other thing, and I don't mean to drone on about this, but one thing I think also we suspect, it's not proven yet in the study, but when you look when we looked at the math growth in middle schools in particular, in these high income settings, one of the things we were seeing among both white kids, but also traditionally disadvantaged minority kids, was some pretty extraordinary mathematics growth in grades 6 through 8. And our theory, and again, we haven't had a chance to test this hypothesis yet, is um, those kids in those minority kids in higher income school systems are getting what I would call upper level or a more rigorous math program than they might be getting in a high poverty public school. So those kids might be getting more pressure or more opportunity, for example, to make sure they get through algebra by the end of 8th grade, or to get prepared for more advanced math. And we were really impressed with the amount of growth we were seeing among uh, traditionally disadvantaged minority kids in those high growth for all public schools at that level. So that's something else Catholic schools might be thinking about with their middle school programs.
Great. And kind of along those lines, Brandy asks, so out of those 16 schools, how many of those were inner city or urban again?
We haven't looked at that. One of the things we lack from Catholic schools is poverty information. So I'd actually have to go back. We de-identified all the schools for purposes of the study, so I know what state they're in, but I don't know what the names of the schools are. We'd have to go back and kind of recreate some information to be able to know.
Right. Kathleen asks, so when you do measure the growth, what mechanisms do you use? And also, how are the schools producing the growth?
So in terms of the mechanisms that we use, we look at growth. Most of our schools test about 3 times a year, but virtually all of our schools test in the fall and the spring. So when we were looking at the growth of the schools in this study for any given year, we generally took into account the prior fall result, the prior spring result, the current fall, the current spring, and then the following fall. And we looked at fall to spring growth every year and spring to spring growth. When we evaluate that growth, we take a couple of things in consideration. One is we control for the starting achievement of the kid, because lower achieving kids generally grow more during the school year. And we also take into account their grade level and the amount of time, the amount of instructional time that passed between tests. So we control for all of those factors so that a low achieving kid's growth is compared to other low achieving kids, and a high achieving kid is compared to other high achieving kids. And then the way we make those comparisons is we do what we call growth norming studies every 3 or 4 years to look at the growth of the national NWEA student population. So when you saw those z-scores, the standard deviations of growth that kids were showing above the norms, what we were doing was comparing the growth of each student in the school, controlling again for those factors that I talked about, to a nationally representative norming group. Um, in terms of instructionally, what are the 16 Catholic schools doing? That's not something that we've yet studied. It may be another phase of the project may be to take some of the high growth for all schools and look more deeply at what's going on inside the school. But in this phase of the study, what we wanted to do was find high growth for all schools and basically see what their demographics were, and then look at this question of whether high growth actually leads to higher achievement.
Great. Well, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to let us know in the chat or the Q&A. You'll see a link to the post-webinar survey in the chat box. So we encourage you to give us your feedback, and there's a certificate of attendance available if you're interested. Great. So Dr. Cronin, is there any final thoughts that you'd like to get in?
Well, again, I think, I want to thank everybody for joining the webinar today and offer, my best wishes and encouragement for your work. It's really hard right now, and you and your educators are just experiencing, I know, and have for close to a year now, an extreme level of challenge. At NWEA, we do appreciate that, and we recognize the sacrifices that you guys are making to keep all of your students doing as well as they can at school. So our encouragement and our prayers are with you as you continue that work. And thank you, really from the bottom of our hearts for what you do.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and a big thank you to you, John, for taking the time to come on and share your resources and research with us. So we appreciate it.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, you'll be seeing a link to the on-demand recording, as well as a copy of the slides and some additional resources in a follow-up email. So please look for that, and we hope to see you next time for the next NCEA webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. God bless.